Don't hesitate. Don't hesitate to enter into the discussion. And any questions or relevant comments, always look forward to hearing from you all as well. So again, without further ado, I'd like to get right to the articles that we sent out for this week. Now, last week, of course, we went over our syllabus. We also talked about the article on loving one's neighbor as oneself, the political component. This is something that I wish every pastor in America would read and take seriously. So many want to avoid anything that's, quote, controversial or they fear is divisive. But as we oftentimes say, frankly, the most controversial, divisive person in human history was Jesus Christ. And we have to address these serious issues and allow the Holy Spirit to direct people's thoughts and actions and so on. Now, many of you are familiar with the Babylon Bee, and we, 2 or 3 times a week, we'll open it up and read the latest articles from the Babylon Bee. This is, as most of you know, fake news that you can trust, okay, as opposed to all the other fake news that we're inundated with these days. And so there were a couple of articles that I thought I'd mention for time's sake, really just more of the headlines than the article themselves. And one that came to my attention actually just this morning was one that addresses the Democratic National Convention of last week. You know, it was billed as a celebration of joy. I think from a Christian perspective, it was nothing less than a celebration of absolute decadence. And so here's an article that appeared in the Babylon Bee. It says, quote, "Oh no, man at DNC, at the Democratic National Convention, thinking he was in line for food truck, accidentally gets a vasectomy." And goes on to talk about how that just a few days earlier than that, he'd also gotten a free abortion. So undoubtedly a very rewarding week for that individual. Here's another one. Kamala explains 93% of her staff has quit because they just couldn't handle the joy. If you've read anything about her and her managerial skills, 93% of her staff, vice presidential staff, has resigned over the last 3 years. Here's another one. Joe Biden found in the dumpster behind DNC Convention Center. And it actually had a picture of a big, dumpster and his legs sticking out of the top of it and so on. What's that? And then here's one that's quite sobering, to say the least. DNC dyes the Chicago River red to celebrate abortion. So nothing humorous about that, but unfortunately, it does tend to correlate to the truth and the agenda of that particular party. Well, the first article I wanted to mention is the one we sent out, and the headline is this: Megan Basham dug into the new David French and Russell Moore Bible study about politics and found some very interesting financial backers. Now, let me just briefly here fill you in on some of these names. They're pretty well known in evangelical circles if you're familiar with evangelical publications and media and so on. David French is an opinion columnist for the New York Times. And over the years, he's written on topics related to law and religion and culture and so on. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School. And in fact, he used to be a president of a very good organization called the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, fire. And they were all about upholding freedom of speech issues in higher education and so on. But he went on from there to become a writer for National Review magazine. And he wrote for the Atlantic magazine, a very left-wing magazine as well. And for the last 2 or 3 years, he's been, as I said, an opinion columnist for the New York Times. So that's David French. We actually brought him in, I don't know, a dozen years or so for an Areopagus forum when we were holding those on a fairly regular basis over at Perimeter Church. Another name that surfaces in several of these articles is Timothy Dalrymple. And Timothy Dalrymple is the president and CEO of Christianity Today magazine. Now, that used to be a very highly esteemed, regarded Christian magazine founded by people like Billy Graham and Carl F.H. Henry and folks like that. But in recent years, it's definitely trended more and more woke all the time. Tim Dalrymple is another speaker who we brought in for an Areopagus forum about a dozen years ago, about the same time that we brought in David French. And he was living at Johns Creek at the time and was a member of Perimeter Church. And then he accepted this position with Christianity Today magazine and moved to Chicago. So David French, Timothy Dalrymple. Another name that crops up from time to time when it comes to these liberalizing trends within evangelicalism is Mark Galli. And Mark Galli was a longtime editor-in-chief of Christianity Today until about 4 years ago, when he became so controversial for his support of Biden and that agenda that he later decided to retire from that position. But Mark Galli is one who has characterized evangelical supporters of Donald Trump as, quote, get this now, these are evangelicals who typically haven't finished college, and if they have jobs, and apparently most of them don't, they are blue collar jobs or entry level work. Now, can you imagine somebody referring to evangelical Christians that way? Let me say that again. Evangelical supporters of Trump, these are evangelicals who often haven't finished college. And if they have jobs, and apparently most of them don't, they are blue collar jobs or entry level work. My gosh, how condescending. Get. Another name that crops up in some of these articles is Russell Moore. Now, Russell Moore was the former president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission for the Southern Baptist Convention. And he left that position. He was very controversial for his liberal views, and he is today the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. So it's very, very sad to see what's become of that publication, which for so many decades, was really upheld basic biblical standards. So again, those names will crop up in several of these articles that we're going to be talking about. Yes, Donna?
Just out of curiosity, what were French and Dalrymple talking about when they spoke to the Areopagus?
Oh my, honestly, I can't recall. Timothy Dalrymple had written his master's or doctorate, either his master's thesis or doctorate dissertation, on something related to Søren Kierkegaard. And, it was a very interesting presentation and all. Now, Kierkegaard certainly has never been described as what we would call an evangelical Christian. But I remember it was quite interesting and not a topic that evangelicals very often will address. As far as David French, I really don't recall what he was speaking.
Very far, 12 or so years since they spoke for the Areopagus.
Well, both of them were starting to trend in this more liberal direction, even at the time. I didn't know them well. I can't even remember who recommended that we bring them in. but they're both very highly educated. Now, Timothy Dalrymple, by the way, was an Olympic class gymnast at Stanford. He got a gymnastics scholarship to Stanford. And I believe it was his freshman year, he broke his neck and came very close to dying. And he went on, finished his degree there, and went on to advanced degrees as well. So, all right, so if you will, look at the article entitled "Megan Basham Dug into the New David French and Russell Moore Bible Study About Politics and Found Some Very Interesting Financial Backers." And so you can kind of follow along. A lot of what I wanted to comment on, I bold-faced in the copy of the article that I sent out to you all.
Can you give us a quick background on Megan
Yeah, Megan Basham. Now, did she write for World Magazine for several years?
Movie reviewer.
Yeah, movie, and was it also music or just yeah? So she's been associated with World Magazine for a number of years, and she has written a new book exposing the leftward trends in evangelical Christianity. So according to the article here written by someone named John Knox, I don't think that's the John Knox that we're all familiar with. I think he's been dead several years. Yeah. It starts out, why is there a group of leftists interested in funding a Bible study aimed to get churches to rise above politics and reject the right versus left divide? Okay. Well, that sentence alone should raise some serious questions. Why is there a group of leftists, many of them not even remotely professing Christians, who are interested in Bible studies aimed to get churches to rise, quote, rise above politics and reject the left versus right divide? It's talking about a new Bible study curriculum pushed by David French, who I mentioned, Russell Moore, and another left-wing evangelical by the name of Curtis Chang. And they have formed something called the After Party as an alternative to the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. If you come down a couple of paragraphs, the website is full of Christianese that sounds nice, but as you dig deeper into it, you find there's some very disturbing positions. So Megan Basham from First Things Magazine and the Daily Wire has looked into this organization. And the summary is essentially this, quote, "These people who claim to be above politics went to radical leftists to fund their Bible study curriculum that's obviously meant to influence churches away from conservative politics." And one of the organizations, of course, that has funded this is the Rockefeller Foundation. That should raise, red flags from the outset here. And yes, both literally and figuratively red flags. Rockefeller is using part of the same grant to fund LGBTQ politics and climate justice projects as well. Now, on the next page, page 2 of that article, you see that the project's website lists One America movement, an ecumenical group that promotes the LGBTQ affirming matter. They're also aligned with Black Lives Matter. They're also aligned with the John Pritzker Family Fund. And that's the same Pritzker, who's the governor, the extreme far left governor of Illinois, all of which fund enterprises promoting abortion, LGBTQ issues, and other left-wing priorities. Next paragraph, this supposedly non-political, quote, Bible study is taking money from the group that gives Planned Parenthood more money than almost anyone else. So obviously, this has a very anti-biblical orientation. Someone, the author writes, someone should ask David French and Russell Moore why they are taking money from enemies of Christ to convince Christians not to proclaim Christ in the public square so that the enemies of Christ can have control over the public square. And then if you come down a couple more paragraphs, as a pro-life Democrat, this Curtis Chang blamed the American church for the January 6th riot, saying we own what happened at the Capitol. He urged California voters to oppose the recall of Governor Gavin Newsom several years ago. And he leveraged his Christian platform to argue against religious exemptions from vaccine mandates as well. And so the article ends there at the bottom of the page by referencing the famous movie from the mid-1970s, All the President's Men, about the Nixon scandal and all. And the basic theme of the movie being follow the money, and you understand what the agenda is. And the writer, John Knox, says, keep an eye out for this curriculum being implemented this election year. I'm sure there's churches all over Metro Atlanta that are probably implementing this. Says, we have a few shepherds, we have very few shepherds and many wolves right now. And that's a sobering thought when it comes to church ministry and even evangelical church ministry. We have very few shepherds, but many wolves right now. So, basic introductory article into some of the things that we want to be discussing. Any thoughts, any comments on that before we move on?
That particular Bible study program that was seemingly designed to make Christians in the pews, everyday rank and file evangelicals, to make them more politically neutral, or to help them become, beyond left and right, that this was launched in Ohio. Megan Basham points out this was launched in Ohio, which is a swing state. So if you wanted to neuter one of your voting blocks that might oppose a specifically more left-wing agenda, that would be what you would do. So we don't want to play innuendo here, because we can't prove, A led to B led to C. But if you reverse engineered, what would they do if they wanted to win? That's what they would do. So reverse engineering still gets you what they did. So,
yes.
So that doesn't prove it. I proved it in that.
Yeah. Very definite agenda to sway evangelical voters in a particular.
Stay home.
And either.
And become above politics. I'm above all that.
Right.
I don't get involved.
Right. Or on the other hand, influencing them to consider the leftist agenda. The next article is Christians Evangelicals Rally for Kamala Harris ahead of the DNC. And you can see this was written just a couple of weeks ago or so. Author is Jack Jenkins. I know nothing about him. But anyway, some interesting points come out of this article. In the first opening paragraph there, a diverse group of Christians is throwing support behind Vice President Kamala Harris. Come on down to the next one, and you see that one of the leaders in this movement is a man named John Pavlovitz, a liberal-leaning Christian author and activist. Next paragraph, he says, we want people to know that there are progressive Christians, there are Christians on the Democratic left-leaning side, so they don't feel alone. So in other words, we need to be, in his mind, more open-minded and inclusive and all. And the result of this trend was Christians for Kamala, and talks about some of their featured speakers and so on who have endorsed Kamala Harris. Now on the page 2 of that article, on the back side, if you come down about midway, you see that many of these people involved rebuke conservative Christianity's ties to the GOP calling it a form of Christian nationalism. Now, Christian nationalism is a term that leftists, liberals and leftists use with regularity to imply that any evangelical Christians who have a conservative orientation, they want to accuse us of trying to impose Christian standards and values on mainstream society. So that's grossly unfair. But having said that, by the way, there are Christian nationalists who do aggressively promote an agenda like that, but that in no way represents most of us. And then at the bottom of that page, we see that the Reverend Franklin Graham, son of the famed evangelist Billy Graham, decried a new advertisement produced by Evangelicals for Harris, targeting swing state voters, saying that it was trying to mislead people by using images of his father. Okay. And you've probably seen that article, over the last couple of weeks or so, where Franklin Graham has come out and said, no, in fact, supposedly in 2016, his father, Billy Graham, voted for Donald Trump. And according to Franklin Graham, his father probably would be a supporter of Donald Trump even today, given the alternative options. Okay. Now, at the top of page 3, you see a reference to an evangelical activist by the name of Shane Claiborne, and an individual by the name of Jerusha Duford, a counselor who's also Billy Graham's granddaughter. And she has come out very, very strongly in support of Kamala Harris as well. Now, I remember reading about her and her husband many, many years ago. I didn't have a chance prior to tonight to go back and read about them, but I know they've always been considered, very much out of the mainstream of that family. And in fact, if I remember correctly, there was some serious scandal involved with this Jerusha's husband many years ago as well. Have to take a few minutes and research that further. But anyway, here's the basic argument that people like that are making, which is, if you look at the next paragraph, we have the choice before us between democracy and authoritarianism. And we would all say, well, yes, that's absolutely what we're facing these days, except for them, it's the Republican Party and conservatives who are the authoritarians who are trying to impose, their values on everyone else. And so the alternative is the agenda put forth by the Democratic Party. If you go down a couple more paragraphs, you see that one of those that's very involved in this movement is Representative Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, the infamous Adam Kinzinger. And people like that, including Kinzinger, will make the argument that some of today's support for Donald Trump amounts to a form of idol worship. Well, again, I'm sure there are some people that probably fall into that category, thinking Donald Trump is the Messiah and so on, but that certainly does not characterize the vast majority of Trump supporters. So in the following paragraph, we read that nearly 500 faith leaders have signed on to a letter endorsing Kamala Harris. And again, this is, a week or two ago. I'm sure it's increased probably dramatically since the Democratic National Convention.
It seemed that they were progressive Christians.
Yes.
Some of them.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't.
Yeah, progressive.
All of them, but
Mm-hmm.
it just seemed like that progressive trend.
Mm-hmm. And it continues to grow within evangelicalism. And one reason it continues to grow is because so few pastors have the courage or the knowledge to, contest this. And So as we know, churches that do take a stand, a clear-cut stand on these political issues, are just a tiny minority within evangelical Christianity. Now, the same trends don't operate that way in liberal churches. They're very aggressive in promoting, their liberal, left-wing, democratic agenda. And but for conservative churches, there's all this reticence that frankly is very much hurting our efforts to have a nation that operates according to just laws and the rule of law and so on. The next article is Evangelicals for Harris. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz draws surprising support from these religious groups. And if you look there at the third paragraph of that article, you read, quote, the New York Times opinion columnist David French, who I mentioned a while ago, a Nashville area writer and a visiting professor at Lipscomb University, said in a column on Monday, now this was just a couple of weeks ago, that he's voting for Harris in order to save conservatism from itself. Now, David French, like Timothy Dalrymple and Russell Moore and people like that, they constantly want to remind us that they are solid conservatives, and but that Donald Trump is destroying any credibility for conservatism in America, especially among conscientious Christians. There is some truth in that, by the way, but the solution for that is not to support a radical leftist party like the Democratic Party and somebody as frankly repulsive as Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. But the point that David French is trying to make, and this shows up in a couple of the other articles that we sent out as well, it's this idea that Donald Trump is so repulsive that we need to vote against him, and then 4 years from now, let's get a better candidate. Well, that's naive beyond belief. It never works in history, but that seems to be their agenda. Is, we can't tolerate this fraud Donald Trump, so let's do everything we can to defeat him. And we'll try to put up with another Democratic administration over the next 4 years, and then we'll come up with a good Republican, a good conservative. But I think anybody that's in touch with the realities of our present time understands how flawed that is. And in fact, another Democratic administration as radical left-wing as Joe Biden's, or before that, Barack Obama's, and certainly Kamala Harris, could very well destroy any potential for any kind of positive change 4 years from now. For one thing, the whole election process could be so utterly corrupted as to make it highly unlikely that we'll ever have a relatively fair and free election again. Look at all the damage that's been done in the last 3.5 years. Do we really want another 4 years of that kind of radical left-wing socialist, anti-Christian, anti-American government? And so I think it's just an absurd agenda that some of these people like David French are promoting. On the
Jeffrey, may
next
I
page
comment?
there of that article. Oh, yes, comment, please.
This is Oren. I remember from my reading in the past, one of the key Marxist Leninist.
Oh, can you speak? Can you speak
Oh, yeah.
louder?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
My speaker may not be as where it should be, but one of the key Marxist Leninist tools or approaches for winning is you could call it a smear, to discredit the person using distasteful language or words to describe your opponent. and just continue, and that's what we're seeing with Donald Trump, is the other side is using language and words of that order. Now we're not used to seeing someone like Donald Trump. We've never seen anyone of his persuasion that did what he did in the first 4 years. Reagan, of course, was
Yeah.
of that nature. But so what? It's not surprising that what's going on. It's a Marxist-Leninist approach to winning is smearing your opposition, and they've got the news media on their side, so they're doing a pretty good job of it, and it's that's the enemy
Yes,
doing
yes,
that. So
yes.
it's their one of their tools. It's
Yeah.
anyway. So
And they very effectively exploit the weaknesses in Donald Trump's character and personality and style. And he too often falls into that trap. That's why so many of us have said for years that Donald Trump is his own worst enemy.
yeah, but what would they say about George Washington? They would
I don't
probably
think George Washington would have had the same character disposition as Donald Trump. Now you're quite right. I mean, Donald Trump certainly accomplished an awful lot as president.
Oh
That
yes,
was
absolutely.
positive. But
Really is.
we do have to understand that conservatives, Republicans, and Christians, by the way, are held to a much, much higher standard than everybody else. So it's very foolish to play into our opponent's hands, with reckless, sloppy language and mannerisms and things like that. But I think we see, Oren, that so much is at stake in this election that we believe that we just have to overlook some of these character flaws in Trump because much more important issues are at stake. But see, unfortunately, a lot of Americans don't think in those terms.
Well,
And
when I
so
first saw
that's
him,
hurting the cause a lot.
the word authentic, one of my when I first saw him in speaking and talking, yeah, he was had a rough New York. He's a New Yorker, so
Well,
it's
yeah.
not surprising that he would have a kind of rough language. But
Mhm.
he's authentic. Anyway, let me finish. I'm sorry for taking your time.
No, I
That's all.
understand. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, we have to call people to a higher level of understanding of what's at stake in this election. And if we need to, as much as possible, overlook somebody's character flaws, personality flaws, stylistic flaws, and so on, well, we understand that what matters are the policies, the programs, and the priorities of the next administration, not somebody's personality. But see, to think that way, you have to think like an adult. And frankly, apparently, most Americans don't think on that level. Most Americans think on a very, very low, almost childish level. But nonetheless, that's the great challenge that we're facing right now. Mhm.
I had a comment.
Yes,
I want to
Donna?
go back to, because you just said this, Billy Graham's granddaughter, the quote you have here,
Mhm.
voting for Kamala for me is so much greater than policies. So she doesn't care about the policies, and she says it right there, to vote against another 4 years of fake leaders justifying the actions of a man who destroys the message of that Jesus came to spread, and that's why I get involved in politics. Nothing to do with policies, which is what you just said.
Yeah,
They don't think about the policies.
Oh, it's so immature, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, so egregiously immature.
Well, to be fair, some of the current Democratic presidential candidate has posted for Kamala.
So you don't have to care about policies to vote for Kamala, so, there you go, perfect candidate.
Well, and that's a good example, Dan, and that is the vast majority of Democrats apparently don't care that much about our policies, so they're thinking on that level as well. Now, we know from her history, she's a hardcore secular leftist, and even worse than Joe Biden. But nonetheless, for people in the Democratic Party, I mean, as long as she's the standard bearer and as long as she's the opponent of Donald Trump, they're all in for her. So again, consider the level of thinking.
Well, that was the only way they could replace Biden and keep the campaign funds.
That's
Was
right.
to have her.
That's right. And, these are not wise people, but they are very smart. They're very shrewd.
But you can be sure if they could have had their pick of who they wanted, it wouldn't have been her.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah. Okay, well, let's continue in this article, Evangelicals for Harris. Kamala Harris, Tim Walz draws surprising support from these religious groups. If you look at the second page of that article, at the top of the page, it's Evangelicals for Harris begin to speak up. We encounter a very well-known Southern Baptist pastor in Texas, Dwight McKissick. And he's in the forefront of a lot of these political issues in the Southern Baptist Convention, very notable Black Southern Baptist pastor. And you see the comment there, McKissick disagrees with Harris's stance on abortion, but is basing his decision to support Harris on the fact that she's the more qualified candidate. The more qualified candidate. What has she ever accomplished in her political life? As vice president, or what has she ever accomplished positively, in her political life in California and in the US Senate? So the most qualified candidate. What an absurd comment. Come down to the next section, the shocking support, and you see the New York Times published David French's latest column, "To Save Conservatism from Itself, I Am Voting for Harris." Again, this is just unfathomable to me that somebody would think on this level. I mean, consider this. We understand that, like everybody we know, including ourselves, everybody is flawed. Obviously, there are no perfect human beings, but some, of course, have more credibility than others, and we have a moral responsibility to support those that will do the most good for the country, whether we like them or not, like their personality or not, approve of all their positions on issues or not. David French, who holds typical traditionalist views, such as opposing abortion and LGBTQ rights, said Trump poses an overall greater threat to French's conservative religious worldview than he does a net benefit. He goes on to say it's difficult to overstate the viciousness and intolerance of the MAGA Christians against their political foes. Well, yeah, sometimes this is manifest in public life, but again, by comparison to the other side, it's very, very minimal as far as I've been able to ascertain.
Jeffrey, isn't it true that you tried to burn down a police station with the officers trapped inside?
Oh, well, yeah, but Amara's listening, so I'm going to disavow that.
Okay.
And no, Dan, we were talking about The Simpsons earlier on, one of my favorite Bart Simpson quotes is, "I didn't do it. You didn't see me do it. You can't prove a thing, man." So I'll leave it at that. All right, at the bottom there of the page, again, a quote from David French. "I loathe sex abuse, pornography, and adultery. Trump has brought those vices into the mainstream of the Republican Party." Okay, well, again, you know.
And Biden has brought it in across our southern border.
Absolutely. So it's not like one side or one candidate, has an exclusive, has an exclusive view on those sorts of things and those kind of indiscretions in the past. Bruce?
It wasn't like Bill Clinton had a clean career that they completely whitewashed. That it's just sex, it doesn't matter what the religion is.
Yeah.
Did he bring that into the core of the Democratic Party? I guess he mustn't. That's what's happening.
Not to mention John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson,
Biden, they had that whole thing
Biden.
about him being accused at the beginning.
Right.
Roosevelt.
So it's just absurd to think that Donald Trump is unique in that regard. And, as far as we know, all of these moral indiscretions on the part of Donald Trump were quite a few years ago, as far as we know. And that's another factor that we have to take into consideration. So.
Think about Hunter laptop.
Right, right. And for those who will argue that, Donald Trump, made a fortune exploiting his business relationships and so on. Well, I'm sure there's plenty to criticize there. But unlike Joe Biden, who made an absolute fortune off his political connections and his associations with Russia, Ukraine, China, of all places. So, okay, let's move on here real quickly. And the next article is, again, at the top of the page. This is page 6, Evangelicals for Harris. And it mentions a person I'd never heard of before, somebody named Reverend Jim Ball, author of Global Warming and the Risen Lord. I thought that was interesting approach to sharing one's faith.
Well, the sun was coming up when Christ rose again from the dead, so, right? I mean, the temperature was rising. Morning, right?
Well, I didn't realize you were an apologist for this Jim Ball, Dan. But for 20 years, he served as an executive in a Christian environmental organization. He was also the architect, apparently, of a book called "What Would Jesus Drive?" And when I read that, I thought, that's kind of a strange topic to bring up. But in fact, we know very, very clearly not Jesus necessarily, but what the early apostles drove. I mean, all you got to do is look in Acts chapter 2, verse 1, and we read that when the day of Pentecost had come, the disciples were all together in one accord. So I don't think there's any question about at least what the disciples would drive, and presumably Jesus too. Now, this man, Jim Ball, has been honored by Rolling Stone magazine. Boy, that's a real source of integrity and authority, as one of their environmental warriors and heroes. And so this is a comment: our nation thrives when its leaders are people of good character. People of good character like Joe Biden, like Kamala Harris, who nobody can stand to work for, by the way. She's lost 93% of her staff as vice president. And so again, talk about, selective moral judgment. It certainly would apply to far more leading politicians than just Donald Trump. Now, I'm going to we're going to skip the next article, and we'll come back and address that next week. But I'd like to move on to article number 4 that I sent out, Why Evangelicals Disagree on the President, by Timothy Dalrymple. And Scott is going to do a presentation on that. And then Dan is also going to do a presentation on article number 6, the last article that we sent out. And again, we'll come back and fill in the gaps next week. But we've talked quite a bit about the case for refusing to vote for Donald Trump because of his sordid past. And it is a pretty sordid past, by the way. I'm reminded by a comment that one of my lifelong friends, Larry Keener, we played baseball together growing up and all. Larry lives out in Dallas, Texas. And Larry is a very good thinker. And we were talking about the Trump issue and the personality and character problems and all that we have to acknowledge. And this is what Larry wrote to me in a email a couple of months ago. Quote, one of my daughters, I think she's an attorney, one of my daughters asked me how I could support Donald Trump when he demonstrates very few of the values in his personal life that I had taught my children and that I always sought to exemplify in my own life. My response was simply this, quote, Donald Trump is certainly reprehensible in many ways, but although he may not live my values in his personal life, he does defend my values in terms of most of his policies. And that's why I support him. Over the years, I've voted for many good men with values like mine, only to be sorely disappointed when they lack the courage to stand up and defend those values while in office. I thought it was a great response on Larry's part. And I'll send that quote out to you all. I think it states what's at stake here as well as anything I've come across, frankly. So, well, let's move on then. And Scott, if you would please come up and share your insights into the article, and very much looking forward to your assessment.
Well, yeah, so this is the Dalrymple article, and it was written on in 2020. So at that time, Trump was the incumbent. And it is entitled, Why Evangelicals Disagree on the President. The reason we're divided and how we can come together. And so what he does is he sets up a comparison between Peter and Jesus. Peter cut off the ear of a man named Malchus in the Garden of Gethsemane, whereas Jesus at the Last Supper, it says, well, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? So he sets up this comparison. Peter is the one who swung the blade, and Jesus is the one who drank the cup of sacrifice. And then what he does is he takes Peter and kind of uses him as an example of a certain set of Christians, and Jesus as the other set of Christians. So one camp declares they cannot comprehend how men and women who share their faith could possibly support the incumbent, which is Trump. The other camp wonders how anyone nurtured by the word could reject the incumbent. And so we have these two groups that can't come together on it. And he says underlying the differences is a different vision of the kingdom of God. So he's setting this up as, the ones who would be sort of standoffish in terms of politics would be aligning themselves with Jesus. So it's sort of a misrepresentation, in my opinion, right off the bat. I think he's not, he's using a context here that probably doesn't apply to our situation. But he says, he goes on here and talks about how I think we, as many of us would feel, we work tirelessly to save the lives of the unborn, defending the religious liberties that permit families and churches to live according to conscience. We work toward a government and a culture that hears Christian concerns and honors Christian values. And then, we look at the other side and say, why don't you support that when it comes to election time? So, and another big one is he talks about, which I resonate with this. I feel like the Democrat Party diminishes our global standing and turns a blind eye to Christian persecution overseas. So all these things, we want to work toward, and it seems like for the greatest good of society as a whole, he says, and the other side just doesn't see that. So he calls this the contingent, the church regnant, or the dominant or influential or the ruling group. And I think he would tend to label all of us probably as that group where we want to work toward a greater America. We think America is a Christian, as Jeffrey has said many times, a Christian influence nation. It's a nation worth saving, a nation worth fighting for. I feel like this characterization is wrong. I don't feel like the church is ruling. Certainly not these days. I think we're far from dominant or influential or any of that, but that's what he characterizes that group of Christians. So that's the one group that he would label a certain set of Christians in. And then the second group he calls the church remnant, which sounds like the better group, doesn't it? The church remnant. We all want to be the remnant. But the remnant tends to come from places where Christianity is not the reigning cultural or political authority. The church remnant trends younger, more diverse, more urban than the church regnant. Members of the church remnant are more likely to live on the margins of power, sometimes deliberately and sometimes by exclusion. It's captivated by a fundamentally different vision of the kingdom of God. The kingdom in this view is too sacred to be confused with winning elections and passing laws. Sounds a little bit like the other article where it's a after party. It's above party, or at least how they would like to characterize themselves. For the church remnant, the kingdom of God is less about the acquisition of power than the divestment of power, laying down our rights and privileges as Christ did in order to serve the powerless. For this reason, the church remnant places a higher priority on the purity of the church. So you can see how this would resonate, with Christians. Certainly sounds like, just on the surface, it sounds like maybe the better option. Of course, it's a lot surface, though. There's a lot of surface here. The church remnant would rather the church lose its influence than its integrity, even if the loss of religious liberties were to lead to persecution. I thought of that. That's a bold statement there in bold that I believe Jeffrey made in bold. What I thought about there, maybe some forms of persecution, perhaps they would be willing to tolerate, but I think if you read, for example, Solzhenitsyn, there's a chapter on interrogation in the Gulag Archipelago. I think anybody who read that chapter would probably not be so inclined to welcome persecution. Just a Marxist, Soviet, communist sort of persecution. That's a lot different than just maybe the persecution that the church remnant is considering here as a good option. If the church loses its integrity and therefore its witness, he says, then then the culture is bound to suffer. I think the church already, in the minds of some people, has long ago lost its witness. I think they're trying to react to what people think, which to me is difficult to control. You can't control what people think. You can only control what is, and try to explain what is the truth. You can't be, I don't think, too concerned about what people are thinking, because they're going to think what they're going to think. How do you battle what people perceive? It's very challenging. I think you just have to do your best to speak the truth and act in the best way you can, and kind of let the chips fall in many cases. And he talks about, again, you see this line of, Trump, I think he's implying here, giving encouragement to narcissism, materialism, greed, lust, racism, sexism, all these things that Trump's accused of doing. And Jeffrey says, very wisely here, is Dalrymple implying that the Democrat Party does not encourage all of these things, which is absurd. Of course, you see these same traits, I think, in spades in the Democrat Party. And then, as the gentleman said online, I believe Orrin, I really resonated with what he was saying. How much of this about Trump is a media creation? I mean, certainly the guy's got his flaws, but everybody's got their flaws. And one of the tactics of communism in the past has been, and if Chuck was here, I would shout out to him because he's written about this, is to focus all of your hate on one individual and vilify that person. That's a communist tactic. And you see it every day, with Trump, he's the guy, right? And the idea is to find that one person, find some negative chart. And all of us could, if we were in a public eye, any of us, as Trump is so exposed, people are going to find things in your past, and then all you have to do is just over and over and over and over repeat that. And the media's got, you've got the media on your side to do that. It's a communist tactic, and we see it all the time with Trump. So the guy is obviously flawed, as anybody is going to be. Maybe he's got more flaws than others, but the next Republican candidate that's going to come along, he's going to be hit the same way, I'm certain. And we're going to find out all the terrible things about him, so it's just a communist tactic. But
Scott.
yeah,
That was obvious when George W. Bush was president. Very nice guy.
Yeah.
And yet he was just vicious with it.
Yeah.
By the media.
Right. Oh yeah. Yeah. It's a pattern. And I think those of us that have lived long enough to see the pattern can pick up on it. Whereas the younger generation of the remnant church, I think, is in their 20s primarily. They just haven't lived long enough to see the pattern, probably. Yeah, the remnant church, they were most concerned with evangelical leaders who created an impression that the entire church has rallied around Trump, particularly when those leaders showed no willingness to publicly condemn his misbehavior or defend the victims of his rhetoric. What I find in church, I can ask you and see how you feel about this. I find more often that I am a bit afraid to even mention Trump in church. I feel like that it's not a topic that people want to hear in church. I don't get the sense that the pastor's up there equating Jesus and Trump. I get the sense that everybody's afraid to speak the name of Trump. So I feel like that's a sort of a disingenuous statement there. I mean, how do you all feel? Are you in churches where the pastor's always talking about how great Trump is every Sunday?
No, not at all.
It seems like there's just this fear to bring him up, right?
Yeah, in liberal churches, they quite overtly speak about
Exactly.
candidates
The
and
opposite,
politics.
right?
Vote for Biden, vote for
Yeah.
Harris, but in the Baptist churches or the conservative churches, they don't say anything.
Right.
So
Just,
it's the complete opposite of what this guy's saying.
yeah. So, yeah, I would agree. That's what I see.
Yeah.
The disagreement between the church remnant and the church remnant is less about holding different values than prioritizing them, he says, prioritizing them differently. The remnant would say they care for the sanctity of life and all these things, but they're not willing to gain influence at the cost of integrity. I would just say, I think our view is, how about working to achieve the best possible outcome? That's to me, and I think, I know Dan has talked about this, like, put the Christian worldview in the center, and then every aspect of our lives should be informed and influenced by the Christian worldview. Not, well, this area of life is kind of messy. I think I just want to be pure and stay over here and not be involved in that one, which seems to be what the remnant is advocating. So, it comes out, Dalrymple says, I belong to the church remnant. And then he goes on and talks about, I think he makes a few more disingenuous statements here, just about how, he laments that so many people now look at evangelicals and see Trump instead of Christ. I don't know what that is. I don't see Trump and Jesus equated. He talks about African-American believers who've been wounded by white evangelical support for the president. Again, I don't know that I'm responsible for a wound of somebody else because I vote a certain way. I don't understand that point really.
It's condescending, if not outright racist.
Yeah. Well, that's what you got. Yeah, that's what Jeffrey wrote.
That means talking down.
You could make the same argument with LGBTQ, like they're wounded because we vote for Trump. You can make the same argument overall, a range of issues. So we're hamstrung. We can't vote for the person we think's better because we might offend somebody else over there.
With what somebody says.
Yeah. So yeah, you don't want to go around offending people, but at the same time, you can't be bound by that, I don't think. And then he says, we have published eloquent arguments for both candidates. So that tells you all you need to know. Like, how can you publish an eloquent argument? I think that's like saying, we don't want to send the Secret Service agents up on that roof. It's too dangerous, right? It kind of reveals your hand, I think. What eloquent argument could there possibly be for, I don't see one for the Democrat side. And that's exactly what Jeffrey says here in the article. So, that's basically the article. So yeah, remnant and regnant. Okay.
Yeah.
I had a comment. When you were saying, I just wanted to say, when he says on that last page on the left-hand column, while I'm sympathetic to each side, I belong to the church remnant. And he says, I say these things not to shame my brothers and sisters. Well, I don't feel shamed.
Right.
So he's taking the high horse anyway. My way's better, but I don't want you to feel bad.
Yeah,
because my way's better. So he's just kind
Of
of
course
saying.
he's saying it to shame them.
Exactly. So I
Well, we can't help it. We're uninformed. We're dumb. That's why he's
Ignorant.
writing.
We're
It's to
not
help us.
college.
Yeah,
We barely have a job.
And bring us to the promised land.
I think the idea here is the remnant is more nuanced and more nuanced position, whereas the regnant, you guys just have kind of ignorant one view of things. So
May I say something here? The enemy has gotten us from being focused on the real thing, and that is liberty. Our founding fathers, the thing was liberty and under God. And here we are talking about things other than what he did as president, his character problems and discussions of that sort. And are we going to vote for him or not because he's a good guy or a bad guy? Well, whereas we don't ever talk about what he did in those 4 years, which in my mind, as old as I am, and I've seen a lot of presidents, he did a lot of good things. I was shocked at how many things he did that were good for America and for liberty. And liberty is it. That's it. And if I already know he's not a perfect person. He's not George Washington, but he's genuine. He's not putting an act. When he's up there on that stage, he's being himself, and you see who he is. He's not trying to pretend like he's some godlike figure. He's being himself. But the man loves America, and what he did as president. No one has done that well in my lifetime, including Reagan. And so the focus, the target, we should be on what he did as president, not what his character is.
Yeah, I really agree with that, Orrin. Thank you very much. Just liberty being the focus instead of all these other things.
Yeah.
Yeah, his accomplishments certainly were impressive in many many respects, and it's what we need to be focused on. I think maybe the most egregious error in this article was his comments about what he calls the church regnate. Regnate means dominant and influential and or even ruling. And that's basically saying that those who support Trump and the Republican agenda and all are trying to rule America. And that's really totally fallacious. I mean, as I said, we have to be honest about this. There are Christian nationalists, but the vast majority of us are not Christian nationalists. And but he's implying here that we want to dominate and control and force Christian values and beliefs and ethics on all of society. No, that's not our agenda whatsoever. You know, we believe in a free, open society governed by the rule of law and equal justice under the law for everyone. Couple of comments real quickly, and then we'll move on. Yes, Millie.
Just been, obviously, this is at the forefront of almost everything. Very flawed candidates, and I go back to what John Stonestreet has said. You're one of them will be president, and I'm stick to the idea, the one that will lessen the most evil.
Yes.
Not all the evil, but the most evil.
Yes.
And then I think about all the bureaucrats who will come along with the administration of whichever one is elected. And I just think of, some that are there now, and, the Department of Health or Welfare, whoever that transgender, just the absolute destruction of the evil, the family torn apart, the abortion. So I just, I keep that in mind.
And you're absolutely right. What we have to keep paramount is there is a vast difference in the agendas of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And, in some respects, they virtually represent two different worldviews. And as I said in something I wrote recently, if you don't believe that the Democratic Party is a radical left-wing socialist party, just compare their platform to the Communist Manifesto. And I think you'll see some startling parallels there. Bruce, I think you had a comment, and then we'll move on.
I didn't already know this, and we all know it already, obviously. Search these articles in vain for an argument which rises above an ad hominem attack on Trump. This bad guy kicks dogs and also order all this stuff into the wind, but never says what his politics were bad or things that didn't work out or whatever. Nothing, I think, to criticize about on policy front. But the media has made this an acceptable argument. Right? No one has to defend themselves on the left.
Total double standard. Yeah. Right.
You must be a worthless, no good person, just like him.
Well, and he must be just utterly evil. I mean, that's the way he's presented in the media, which is just, again, a gross distortion of reality. Okay, Dan is going to finish us up. And this is the article. It was actually the last article sent out called How the Evangelical Elite Failed Their Flock. And this is a review of Megan Basham's book, shepherds for sale. So Dan, looking forward to
Well,
your
that's how you're
comments.
billing it. I have a couple of adjustments. Oh, there's a bunch of people. There's a bunch of people in this box. Look at all these people. Oren, are you still there? Oren, you got stuck with the, I think Oren wandered off.
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, Oren, you got stuck with the bill on the garlic knots last week. I owe you $7, so keep that in mind the next time you see me.
Don't worry about it.
All right. Another program note on our restaurant here is that do tip your server very generously. Those stairs we climbed up, all of our food and drink is coming up those stairs. So keep that in mind. Anyway, thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Scott. Y'all afterwards do get to know Scott if you haven't already met him. He's a former pastor. He's written an apologetics book. He runs the, don't tell me the, hold on, I know the word. It's a sustainable development farm at Toccoa Falls College, which is a Christian college, Georgia's Christian college near Toccoa, Georgia. And it is from the Christian Missionary Alliance tradition, which is just fine. And anyway, so greetings, everyone. So yes, Jeffrey did some really good yeoman work for me tonight by introducing the whole subject, the whole topic of Megan Basham, because yes, we are going to get to this book. We watched the movie a couple of weeks back. Scott, I don't know if you were here for the movie night, but okay, you've seen it. All right. So we are going to get to this, I promise. So Jeffrey did me a great service by introducing the whole topic of Megan Basham and her book. I have not yet read the book. It just came out a month ago and went straight up into New York Times bestseller status. She has created a lot of enemies already. Is everyone here familiar with the term Big Eva? Has everybody heard about Big Eva? Okay, Big Eva is what some people call the evangelical elite. You know, it's the article we call the evangelical elite. Some people called it, back in the 80s, we called it the evangelical establishment. And what we're talking about is certain, I would say, you know, highly educated, usually pretty well funded institutions, Wheaton College in Illinois, the National Association of Evangelicals, Christianity Today magazine, InterVarsity and InterVarsity Press, long-standing institutions, many with great, noble and rich pasts who've done great work. However, things started getting a little strange in the 1980s, which is why I'm augmenting this this article with some other material. Now, y'all who've been here a couple of weeks and we saw the film, let me just ask you if these few sentences sound at all familiar, okay? See if any of this sounds at all familiar. Whatever the odds, we must act. There are many things that will oppose this action, but none are more deadly than a certain myth, the myth of neutrality. This myth asserts that those who have accepted by blind faith the secular humanistic doctrine or the Marxist doctrine or the liberal doctrine or any other secular religion are somehow neutral in their views and more scientific than those who live by religious beliefs and principles. You everybody heard anything like that before? How about this? How about this? The first thing Christians must do is to free their own minds from the opposition's propaganda. Those with religious convictions had better cut through the slowly increasing mass of cobwebs being spun around them to keep them quiet and assert their rights and privileges as equal citizens in society. It is ridiculous that Christians not be allowed to express their views in terms of social or legislative issues because of the church-state division. It would be equally ridiculous to expect the feminist, the humanist, the atheist, the communist, or whatever to promise not to interpret and contribute to society from his own point of view. Arguing that these issues are private religious matters and not ones for legislative action is absurd. If life and death, killing and the right to life are not issues for legislators, what is? Does any of that sound at all familiar from this class? That was written in 1980 by Frankie Schaeffer, Schaeffer's son, back when he was good. I have a talk that was done for the Areopagus. Catch me later. I'll email it to you if you're interested. He did some really great work in the years 1977 to 1987 before he wandered rather seriously off the reservation. Now back to Megan's book for a minute. So the targets that she has painted are mostly figures from Big Eva or the evangelical elite or the evangelical establishment. People with large outsized reputations, many of which are earned good reputations, but who have tacked in a certain unfortunate direction, and unhelpful to life and liberty and property and other things that we tend to value in the Christian community. And the other thing is they're not especially honest about it. So every time she catches them in something, somehow things just mysteriously disappear from their website when she calls them out on things. And so she relies in the book. And again, I have not received my copy of the book yet, but I have listened to quite a number of Megan Basham discussions on YouTube, which are very easy to find. She's been doing this big book tour, and so she boasts in the book that, yeah, you're not escaping the Wayback Machine. There's a website called the Wayback Machine, and you can go back and see what the internet website looked like in 2017, 2018, 2019. And so you take it off the website. It's not there now. That's true, but you can see exactly what it looked like. They take pictures of things, and so yeah. So at minimum, you would want these institutions and groups that she calls out to own their own views and say, yes, we did sponsor this conference that was LGBTQ affirming and so on. And yes, we did create this curriculum and distribute it. And yes, it's true. The money that came for that came from George Soros and the Open Society Institute and all these things. Now, again, as with Trump, the waters are muddy because I have to freely tell you up front, Megan Basham's book has mistakes in it. She admits this in her talks. And it's just been out a month. There's going to be, I'm sure, I mean, it went straight to the bestseller list. It's a New York Times bestseller. And I'm pretty sure that the second edition will be out very shortly. And she has a whole list of adjustments. Most of the errors in the book are trivial. There's one or two that do seem more substantial. For example, if you say that a certain grant that was received, if you say that a certain dollar amount was for the year 2018 and it was really from the years 2008 through 2018, well, that's not quite just a typo. That's a significant, because then those dollars don't look so sinister huddled into 1 year if it's over a 10-year period. So things like that will be fixed. But just as with Trump, it seems to me, and again, you don't have to trust me on this, and I'm about to give you a tour on this, so you don't have to trust me. But very briefly, I was just going to say that well, let me say this. Let me put it this way. She is going to fix these errors. But here's the cool thing is this article that we are discussing that Jeffrey printed off of First Things magazine. If anybody isn't familiar with First Things magazine, it was created by the late Richard John Newhouse as an intellectual, conservative Christian journal to cover things on the very highest levels. It's kind of a joke that Newhouse stole not only the title, but even the font of the title from a book by Hadley Arkitz, who is a natural law lawyer and thinker and convert from Judaism. But anyway, so this article is taken from First Things. Megan Basham has her own article in First Things about this phenomenon that she writes about in the book. She's been writing on these topics for various publications, and she's actually states that she's quite relieved actually now to be out of evangelicalism, in terms of, not that she's not renounced her faith or anything, but she stated how empowering it is. She now works for the Daily Wire, which doesn't have any evangelical sponsors or associations. And the book is published by HarperCollins, which is also not an evangelical publisher. So let's say she worked for Salem and the book was published by Salem. Well, then she's got all of these people who can pull strings and say, well, can you feather this? Can you shade that? Can you neuter this phrase? And so she is relishing her independence. But anyway, I would call your attention to First Things Magazine, ft.com, I think is the website, and Google up this article and also Megan Basham's own article. And the reason is, especially on this article, is that you will see highlighted sections here, not for emphasis by Jeffrey, but just that came with it, like David French, Andy Stanley, J.D. Greer, Warren Cole Smith. There's a lot of little highlights in there. Well, on the website, if you go to the First Things article, all of these are links to other people's comments. And some of these are quite scathing against the book. Some of them are quite wonderful in favor of the book. And so, as one TV network once said, we report you decide. So you get to chew it up and spit it out and stuff. But my conviction, and I think I can defend it as an informed conviction. My informed conviction on Megan Basham's whole case that she makes is that it's about 95% pure, and those errors need to be adjusted. However, most people's who have been caught in her sights, I guess we can't say that after Trump's assassination attempt, but those who have been targets of her invective and her exposing what they've done have tried to point to the typos and errors and say, well, see, she doesn't know what she's talking about. She's playing fast and loose. This is a smear. This is a hit job. It's not a hit job. She's very methodical, but she did have this huge amount of research. My understanding is there's something like 50 pages, just footnotes at the end. So she's not playing here. She's a professional journalist. She's paid to do this. She knows what she's doing. She made mistakes, but these things happen is how I would say this. Couple of things before I go. I introduced the topic of Big Eva. And again, this, what I quoted originally was from 1980, when the Schaeffers were suddenly being kind of shown the door by evangelical establishment. Schaeffer, who had written all of these books and done the film series and everything else, was suddenly being made to feel unwelcome by these institutions. For example, when they did the city tour, the 22 city tour, whatever it was, or whatever happened to the human race, they're in Chicago. Okay, well, Wheaton's in Chicago. The Wheaton students can come and learn about abortion and euthanasia and cloning and all of these things. No, Wheaton scheduled mandatory chapel services to coincide. And again, I can't prove that, but that was the perception of everybody at the time, that they were being basically hamstrung and prevented from going to see this.
Dan,
yes.
you know, by contrast, just a few years earlier, he came to Westminster School
Yes.
in Atlanta and lectured, you know, for what, a week or something like that.
Yeah.
So once he made the transition into social criticism, that's when so many evangelicals cut him off.
Exactly. And so let me just wrap this up by giving a couple of quotations. Mark Noll, who was an evangelical thinker and writer, you've seen him in the pages of Christianity Today. He is, in fact, a Big Eva sort of figure. Not that he's a bad man or anything like that. I'm sure he's super smart and well-educated and accomplished and credentialed and has great erudition and all this. He calls it, quote, a campaign of demagoguery that Frankie and other publishers and Christians got together to get InterVarsity Press to pull a book that they introduced in 1984. This is how far back, the stuff that Megan Basham is complaining about goes back quite a ways. In 1984, and yes, that's Orwell's year, they brought out a book, InterVarsity Press brought out a book with Huxley's title. It was called Brave New People, not Brave New World, but Brave New People. So pro tip, everybody, don't introduce a Huxleyan title in an Orwellian year. I'm just saying, because the book was written by an Australian, he might have been Kiwi, he might have been from New Zealand, but he was from somewhere down under, and he was supposedly a Christian ethicist, and he wrote a book praising therapeutic abortion. And I will read you just a couple of quotes. And this is what InterVarsity published in 1984. There are sometimes family situations where inadequacy, marital breakdown, financial stringency, unemployment, and a host of other adverse social conditions could lead to the conclusion that abortion of an unwanted pregnancy or of a pregnancy with a dubious outcome is the least tragic of a number of tragic options. Christians with a high view of human life will emphasize the preservation of life, and yet will take into account the mental, spiritual, and financial resources of the family, and also the availability of social and welfare services for handicapped children in the community, which is pretty much the beginnings. Those kind of quotes is what you found. We mentioned in Metaxas's book. Of course, we're basing this. He's basing his whole critique off of Bonhoeffer and what happened in the German church. Those kind of quotes is exactly what you got out of Germany in 1933, 34. Long before the actual Holocaust, you were going to sideline anybody who was handicapped or weak or defective or lame or maimed or anything else. They were going to be shoved aside. One last quote, which may help us to understand and explain the phenomenon of what we call the evangelical elite or Big Eva. I didn't bring it with me. I couldn't find it. I've got all these books and I couldn't find the one I wanted to find, but I found the quote.
Dr. Schaeffer, the elder Schaeffer, Francis Schaeffer, in his book, The Great Evangelical Disaster, which, by the way, I was just heartened this week to learn that Megan is familiar with that book and its critique. So she knows that this has been going on for 40 years. Dr. Schaeffer quotes the husband and wife sociology team, Bridget and Peter Berger, who were Lutherans, I believe, and they had a Christian testimony of some sort, but yet were professional degreed sociologists, and they analyzed the fact, and if anybody's read any, Bruce probably has, any Peter Drucker, the management guru, he talks about the, and James Burnham back in the 50s wrote about the managerial revolution, that in the 20th century, suddenly knowledge became this big thing. It wasn't just you were going to hammer nails on an anvil or something like that. No, you have to run the enterprise, and you have to run this vast enterprise like General Motors in a certain way, and that itself is a skill. And so the managerial revolution was a big thing. Well, the Bergers bring up what they call is a quote, they call it a decadent, let me find the phrase, they call it the decadent syndrome, and what they're referring to is post-war Western left-wing ideas. So political leftism, zero growth and zero population theories, anti-nuclear and more generally anti-technological sentiments, pacifism and a benignly non-aggressive posture in international relationships and relations, a deep suspicion of patriotism, and a generally negative attitude to the values of discipline, achievement, and competitive. Basically, my left-wing upbringing. I mean, they're talking about my life up to 1985. So they're talking about my generally left-wing worthless past. In fact, I told one of the waiters that if they put in they hired me, they would have a dumbwaiter. But anyway, here's the thing: the Bergers, husband and wife, Peter and Brigitte, and I will finish with this. They make the point that the decadent syndrome is not distributed uniformly through our societies. And this is written in 1983 or thereabouts, or maybe even a little earlier. Both in North America and in Western Europe, it is concentrated in those strata that we have described as the new knowledge class. In the case of evangelicalism, this corresponds to the evangelical leadership, especially as found in evangelical knowledge industries such as education and print media, though it radiates into other strata from this epicenter. There are other classes, notably the lower middle and working classes, and large, relatively unassimilated ethnic groups that are much less marked by this syndrome, and in some instances not touched at all by it. The fate of the bourgeois family, and we believe the future survivability of these societies, thus hinges on the future development of these groups. And so Schaeffer says, or in other words, as applied to evangelical leadership, the Bergers are pointing out that the leadership within evangelicalism has accommodated to the ideas which happen to be in vogue among the secular knowledge class. And I was shocked just this week to learn, I was reading one of these links, that you chase down from these articles, and I couldn't reproduce it for you right now, but it turns out that people like David French, and I know he writes for the New York Times, but there was a quote, it may have been Dalrymple, they were admitting, and without any shame, they were admitting that they still believe that the New York Times and the Washington Post, that these are prestigious institutions, and we want to be liked by them, and they are the people you have to get them to check your box and stuff. And it's like, no, this is the Church of God, we have the Savior, we have the eternal life. They should come to us and say, show us the way to the Father, and yet they don't. So anyway, so that's kind of all I've got. But do go and look on First Things and dig up both articles. This is the one by Bethel McGrew, and do chase down those links if you're interested, both positive and negative reviews of her book. And again, it's like Trump. Some of this stuff is like trying to nail spaghetti to the wall, because you have this criticism, which is 4/5 correct, and this defense, which is 4/5 correct. And you have to sort of mentally overlay these things and go, okay, well, I'm definitely going with Megan here, except for these two things. So anyway, blessings on your week, as Jeffrey always says.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. That reference you made to evangelicals trying to ingratiate themselves and earn the respect of the secular media, like the New York Times and Washington Post, that came out of one of these articles by Dalrymple. And Dalrymple, again, President, CEO of Christianity Today, was talking about how that whenever Christianity Today articles were cited approvingly in the New York Times and so on, how the staff there at Christianity Today was just so elated, as
That's
if
the quote I was thinking of. Yeah, they're just jazzed. It's like, wow,
Mhm.
we made it. We finally made it.
Yeah,
The people in the sewer, they like us.
yeah. Mhm. Right. And that's one of the major criticisms, about these trends and all. Yeah, thank you very much. By the way, the article that you did ends with this. In the end, Megan Basham desires not to tear the church down. She is a critic of many of the trends in evangelicalism, but her desire is not to tear the church down, but to build it up. She desires to see the pure gospel truth that saved her soul taken up and preached without compromise and without apology. And so, like any, I think, honest and reputable Christian leader, that's truly her agenda, and she's to be applauded for it. So I guess her book is supposed to be out in a week or two.
No, it came out a month ago.
It
Mine
has
just
been
Mine
out.
just hasn't arrived at my PO box yet.
Oh, okay. So it sounds like a very, very worthy book to read. I don't know if it's on the level of Rod Dreher's Benedict Option and Eric Metaxas's Letter to the American Church or not, but it sounds like a very, very worthwhile.
I would rank it very close.
Well-
Just I know so far, I would rank it right side by side with Schaeffer's The Great Evangelical Disaster.
Yeah, well, Jeff, I saw her speak at the SES conference last year. It's a very different kind of book. It's not, it's not philosophical. It's here are the claims and here's my exhaustive list of pieces of evidence to show it. So it's much more of a journalistic book. But I mean,
I'm sorry, you said what, Eric?
it's much more of a journalistic book. It's
Yeah.
here are all the claims I'm making. Here's the exhaustive pieces of evidence I have to back it up. It's
Okay.
an expose.
Well, I hope we all will read it, and some of us are in book clubs and so on, and sounds like a very, very worthy book to be included in your group discussions and all. All right, well, thank you very much. We went a little bit over time this evening, but thank you. Good to see you all who joined us online and those here in the room here at Camp's Restaurant as well. And very much looking forward to moving on. Now, for next week, we'll have 2 articles that we'll focus on that I think you'll find to be extremely valuable. And then starting the week after, we will begin a systematic review and study of Eric Metaxas's Letter to the American Church. So a lot more coming. And I think you'll find it to be extremely relevant, extremely worthwhile. So blessings on the week. Pardon me? So blessings on the rest of your week. Good to see you all. And let's be a source of true light and love and truth this week in every area of our lives.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Yeah. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good being